Hi, friends. Welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 5 of our read along together of Emma by Jane Austen. Good stuff going on. For those of you who happened to look in on the group earlier, you might have seen that I issued a bit of a tea challenge for this week. I thought it would be kind of fun to play around with the idea of Valentine's by having some themed teas. And so I suggested that it would be fun if anyone else wants to do it too, to try to serve Valentine's appropriate teas. And so by that I mean things that are either colored red or pink. This one's a looks a little muddy from where it is there, but when the light shines through it, I can see this beautiful red, like garnet color. Let me go ahead and pour this out. We'll see how it looks in the glass. If you can see the red a bit better. I think you can. So this tea that I'm drinking today is a loose leaf herbal tea that I really want to show the box. So I'm going to wait to finish pouring before I do that. It smells so good. This one is it's by Good Earth and it's called Rosa de Jamaica. And what's especially fun about it, it shows that it's made up of strawberry, hibiscus, and lemon myrtle. But if you check this out on the back, it shows you if you were to look at the loose leaf tea, like which parts are which, like what's the dried strawberry, what's the dried hibiscus, and what's the dried lemon myrtle. So I just thought that was a really fun way of doing the ingredients in the tea so that way you can actually identify as you're drinking it what are the different parts. So there you go. So that's my pink tea of the day, Rosa de Jamaica. Mm. Oh, that is nice. So yeah, it's a hibiscus tea with just a little bit of the lemon myrtle and the strawberry flavor. The hibiscus is the predominant flavor. Very nice. I think that would be good with a little bit of sweetener also, but it's just fine on its own as well. So that's my pink or my red tea of the day. If you're interested, I'm curious to see if you guys can also drink some pink or red teas or maybe something with love in the name. I've got a special one, hello, that I'm going to do later this week. That's actually a heart-shaped tea. You'll see when I show it to you, it'll make more sense. But yeah, we've got some fun stuff coming up. Also, speaking of things that are coming up, we had some polls going on over this past week, and thank you to everybody who voted. It looks like by popular acclaim, we are going to be watching at the end of this read aloud together. We'll watch a production of Emma with a period at the end, the period piece that was released in 1920, or sorry, 2020, just last year. So a more recent film, hopefully one that not all of us have seen. I know I haven't seen it yet. If there's anyone who has seen it and would like to weigh in the comments, let us know. Otherwise, I'm hoping it'll be a new experience for most of us to get to enjoy together. And as to when we're going to watch it, well, that was the tiebreaker. It was tied between, you guys still wanted 3 o'clock. So we had 3 o'clock on Friday and 3 o'clock on Saturday. I'm going to be the tiebreaker. Oh, so such pressure. I was really hoping somebody else would vote and break the tie except for me. So I'm going to make it on Saturday the 13th. And the reason being, I was thinking that if we did it on the Friday at 3 o'clock, because it's a longer than usual program, if there's anyone who is still at work at that time, it might be hard to tune in. So I'm going to put it on to Saturday the 13th at 3 o'clock. So that's when we're going to do our screening of Emma with the period at the end, the 2020 edition of Emma. So yay, thank you to everybody who voted. And let's go ahead and talk a bit about the readings that we had on Thursday. I'll try to keep it relatively brief because this is a bit of a long reading today. We're going to do 3 chapters, chapters 11, 12, and 13. So let's go back and talk about the 2 that we read together on Thursday. Chapter 9 was basically Emma continuing with the machinations of trying to pair up Harriet Smith and Mr. Elton, the vicar. And in chapter, whoops, I went back too far. I almost went to chapter 11. In chapter 9, the main thing that happened in that chapter was that Emma and Harriet are writing a book of riddles and charades, which I think I think of charades. I wonder if it's charades. I'm not sure what's the proper pronunciation on that one used in this context. But basically, it's a riddle where you're trying to guess different syllables or parts or short parts of words to make a combined word together, and that's the clue. So in this, Mr. Elton contributes a charade to the or a riddle to the book of Miss Smith, except he doesn't actually give it to Miss Smith for her book. He gives it to Emma instead and says, I don't know if this would quite be right for her collection. I don't want to expose it to a public eye. It was something that my friend wrote, but maybe you'd be willing to look at it. And so when Emma looks at this, she's like, oh my God, Harriet, this is so meant for you. He doesn't want it for your book. This is a private message for you, but I'll help you decipher it, because apparently Harriet has trouble deciphering it. And basically the clue of it is courtship. That he's this riddle that he's given her is about courtship. And the idea is that if she responds favorably to the receipt of the riddle or the charade, that it means that she is perhaps willing to accept his courtship of her. Ooh, kind of romantic and sweet, right? And so Emma is just so excited that Mr. Elton did this thing for Harriet, and it's quite lovely. She actually copies it into Harriet's book, minus the last couple of lines, which are a little too personal. And then she tells Mr. Elton that she has, that she's done this thing, and that they thank him for the poem that his friend contributed. And it's a rather interesting little scene. Let's see. Oh, they also, sorry, later on too, Emma speaks to her father and says how her sister Isabella, who's married to Mr. John Knightley, the attorney who is also the brother of the Mr. Knightley whom we met previously, that they are planning a visit. This will come up in today's reading. That's why I brought that up. Yeah, so basically, Emma tells Mr. Elton that she has copied this into the book, and that they thank him for the riddle, and they quite enjoyed it. In the next chapter, chapter 10, Harriet and Emma go to visit a neighbor who is rather poor, and Emma is basically going to do charity work. And it's nicely intended, and she goes, and on the way they pass, I can see something in my scarf. On the way they pass they pass Mr. Elton's home at the vicarage, and they're like, well, I really can't think of a reason to go in. And by the way, if you have a chance to read the article about introductions and the formality of introductions that Helen posted last week to our group, it's great. I think that especially as modern readers, sometimes it's hard for us to understand the nuances of how formal the society was at the time. And so, for example, what Emma says was like, oh, because Harriet sort of like hints that she would like to see it. She's never been inside the vicar's house, and Emma says, I wish we could contrive it, but I cannot think of any tolerable pretense for going in. No servant that I want to inquire about of his housekeeper, no message from my father. So again, it's very much accepted between the two of them and between contemporary readers that there's no excuse that Emma could make up to go into this home uninvited along with her friend Harriet, that they need to have a proper introduction or a proper reason. So yeah, that article on introductions is rather fun. Let's see. So after Harriet and Emma pay this call, this charitable visit, on their way back, they again pass Mr. Elton's house, and this time he comes out, and Emma contrives for the two of them to walk together while she'll walk behind. She actually then bends down and like snaps her shoelace so she can claim, oh dear, I can't continue to walk on with my broken shoelace. Would it be possible for us to go in, for me to speak with your housekeeper? Aha, that is something she can do. And so, yes, he invites them into his home. And so she speaks to the housekeeper, and she dawdles as long as she can with the housekeeper to try to give Mr. Elton and Harriet time to be alone together. But alas, he does not declare his love for her. He doesn't declare himself. They do seem to have a fun conversation, but he did not come to the point. And Emma thinks to herself that Mr. Elton is cautious, very cautious. He advances inch by inch and will hazard nothing till he believes himself secure. So she is hopeful, though, that they are getting closer and closer to the grand event, the declaration of their love, the match made perfect. I don't know how much it is of our Valentine's teas or how much it is that just the love story we've got going on, but I've got that song Love is in the Air playing in my head. Oh, it's a good thing. All right. Today we are reading, as I said, 3 chapters, chapters 11, 12, and 13. Let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 11. Mr. Elton must now be left to himself. It was no longer in Emma's power to superintend his happiness or quicken his measures. The coming of her sister's family was so very near at hand that first in anticipation and then in reality it became henceforth her prime object of interest, and during the 10 days of their stay at Hartfield it was not to be expected, she did not herself expect, that anything beyond occasional fortuitous assistance could be afforded by her to the lovers. They might advance rapidly if they would, however. They must advance somehow or other, whether they would or no. She hardly wished to have more leisure for them. They are people who the more you do for them, the less they will do for themselves. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, from having been longer than usual absent from Surrey, were exciting, of course, rather more than the usual interest. Till this year, every long vacation since their marriage had been divided between Hartfield and Donwell Abbey. But all the holidays of this autumn had been given to sea bathing for the children, and it was therefore many months since they had been seen in a regular way by their Surrey connections, or seen at all by Mr. Woodhouse, who could not be induced to get so far as London, even for poor Isabella's sake, and who consequently was now more nervously and apprehensively happy in forestalling this too short visit. He thought much of the evils of the journey for her, and not a little of the fatigues of his own horses and coachman who were to bring some of the party the last half of the way. But his alarms were needless, the 16 miles being happily accomplished, and Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, their 5 children, and a competent number of nursery maids, all reaching Hartfield in safety. The bustle and joy of such an arrival, the many to be talked to, welcomed, encouraged, and variously dispersed and disposed of, produced a noise and confusion which his nerves could not have borne under any other cause, nor have endured much longer even for this. But the ways of Hartfield and the feelings of her father were so respected by Mrs. John Knightley that in spite of maternal solicitude for the immediate enjoyment of her little ones, and for their having instantly all the liberty and attendance, all the eating and drinking, and sleeping and playing which they could possibly wish for, without the smallest delay, the children were never allowed to be long a disturbance to him, either in themselves or in any restless attendance on them. Mrs. John Knightley was a pretty, elegant little woman, of gentle, quiet manners, and a disposition remarkably amiable and affectionate, wrapped up in her family, a devoted wife, a doting mother, and so tenderly attached to her father and sister that, but for these higher ties, a warmer love might have seemed impossible. She could never see a fault in any of them. She was not a woman of strong understanding or any quickness, and with this resemblance of her father she inherited also much of his constitution, was delicate in her own health, over careful of that of her children, had many fears and many nerves, and was as fond of her own Mr. Wingfield in town as her father could be of Mr. Perry. They were alike, too, in a general benevolence of temper and a strong habit of regard for every old acquaintance. Mr. John Knightley was a tall, gentlemanlike, and very clever man, rising in his profession, domestic, and respectable in his private character, but with reserved manners which prevented his being generally pleasing, and capable of being sometimes out of humour. He was not an ill-tempered man, not so often unreasonably cross as to deserve such a reproach, but his temper was not his great perfection, and indeed, with such a worshipping wife, it was hardly possible that any natural defects in it should not be increased. The extreme sweetness of her temper must hurt his. He had all the he had all the clearness and quickness of mind which she wanted, and he could sometimes act an ungracious, or say a severe thing. He was not a great favourite with his fair sister-in-law. Nothing wrong in him escaped her. She was quick in feeling the little injuries to Isabella, which Isabella never felt herself. Perhaps she might have passed over more had his manners been flattering to Isabella's sister, but they were only those of a calmly kind brother and friend, without praise and without blindness, but hardly any degree of personal compliment could have made her regardless of that greatest fault of all in her eyes which he sometimes fell into, the want of respectful forbearance towards her father. There he had not always the patience that could have been wished. Mr. Woodhouse's peculiarities and fidgetiness were sometimes provoking him to a rational remonstrance, or sharp retort equally ill bestowed. It did not often happen, for Mr. John Knightley had really a great regard for his father-in-law, and generally a strong sense of what was due him. But it was too often for Emma's charity, especially as there was all the pain of apprehension frequently to be endured, though the offence came not. The beginning, however, of every visit displayed none but the properest feelings, and this being of necessity so short might be hoped to pass away in unsullied cordiality. They had not been long seated and composed when Mr. Woodhouse, with a melancholy shake of the head and a sigh, called his daughter's attention to the sad change at Hartfield since she had been there last. "Ah, my dear," said he, "poor Miss Taylor! It is a grievous business." "Oh, yes, sir," cried she with ready sympathy. "How you must miss her! And dear Emma, too! What a dreadful loss to you both! I have been so grieved for you. I could not imagine how you could possibly do without her. It is a sad change indeed. But I hope she is pretty well, sir?" "Pretty well, my dear, I hope, pretty well. I do not know but that the place agrees with her tolerably." Mr. John Knightley here asked Emma quietly whether there were any doubts of the heir of Randalls. "Oh, no, none in the least. I never saw Mrs. Weston better in my life, never looking so well. Papa is only speaking of his own regret." "Very much to the honor of both," was the handsome reply. "And do you see her, sir, tolerably often? And do you see her, sir, tolerably often?" asked Isabella in the plaintive tone which just suited her father. Mr. Woodhouse hesitated. "Not near so often, my dear, as I could wish." "Oh, papa, we have missed seeing them but one entire day since they married. Either in the morning or evening of every day, excepting one, have we seen either Mr. Weston or Mrs. Weston, and generally both, either at Randalls or here. And as you may suppose, Isabella, most frequently here. They are very, very kind in their visits. Mr. Weston is really as kind as herself. Papa, if you speak in that melancholy way, you will be giving Isabella a false idea of us all. Everybody must be aware that Miss Taylor must be missed, but everybody ought also to be assured that Mr. and Mrs. Weston do really prevent our missing her by any means to an extent we ourselves anticipated, which is the exact truth." "Just as it should be," said Mr. John Knightley, "and just as I hoped it was from your letters. Her wish of showing you attention could not be doubted, and his being a disengaged and social man makes it all easy. I have been always telling you, my love, that I had no idea of the change being so very material to Hartfield as you apprehended, and now you have Emma's account, I hope you will be satisfied." "Why, to be sure," said Mr. Woodhouse. "Yes, certainly, I cannot deny that Mrs. Weston, poor Mrs. Weston, does come and see us pretty often, but then she is always obliged to go away again." "It would be very hard for Mr. Weston if she did not, papa. You quite forget poor Mr. Weston." "I think, indeed," said John Knightley pleasantly, "that Mr. Weston has some little claim. You and I, Emma, will venture to take the part of the poor husband. I, being a husband, and you not being a wife, the claims of the man may very likely strike us with equal force. As for Isabella, she has been married long enough to see the convenience of putting all the Mr. Westons aside as much as she can." "Me, my love?" cried his wife, hearing and understanding only in part. "Are you talking about me? I am sure nobody ought to be, or can be, a greater advocate for matrimony than I am. And if it had not been for the misery of her leaving Hartfield, I should never have thought of Miss Taylor but as the most fortunate woman in the world. And as to slighting Mr. Weston, that excellent Mr. Weston, I think there is nothing he does not deserve. I believe he is one of the very best-tempered men that ever existed. Excepting yourself and your brother, I do not know his equal for temper. I shall never forget his flying Henry's kite for him that very windy day last Easter. And ever since, his particular kindness last September 12th in writing that note at 12 o'clock at night, on purpose to assure me that there was no scarlet fever at Cobham. I have been convinced there could not be a more feeling heart nor a better man in existence. If anybody can deserve him, it must be Miss Taylor. Where is the young man? Said John Knightley. Has he been here on this occasion, or has he not? He has not been here yet, replied Emma. There was a strong expectation of his coming soon after the marriage, but it ended in nothing, and I have not heard him mentioned lately. But you should tell them of the letter, my dear, said her father. He wrote a letter to poor Mrs. Weston to congratulate her, and a very proper, handsome letter it was. She showed it to me. I thought it very well done of him indeed. Whether it was his own idea, you know, one cannot tell. He is but young, and his uncle, perhaps. My dear papa, he is 23. You forget how time passes. 23! Is he indeed? Well, I could not have thought it, and he was but 2 years old when he lost his poor mother. Well, time does fly indeed, and my memory is very bad. However, it was an exceeding good, pretty letter, and gave Mr. and Mrs. Weston a great deal of pleasure. I remember it was written from Weymouth, and dated September 28th, and began, My dear Madam. But I forget how it went on, and it was signed F. C. Weston Churchill. I remember that perfectly. How very pleasing and proper of him, cried the good-hearted Mrs. John. Oh, excuse me. How very pleasing and proper of him, cried the good-hearted Mrs. John Knightley. I have no doubt of his being a most amiable young man. But how sad it is that he should not live at home with his father! There is something so shocking in a child's being taken away from his parents and natural home. I never can comprehend how Mr. Weston could part from him. To give up one's child! I really never could think well of anybody who proposed such a thing to anybody else. Nobody ever did think well of the Churchills, I fancy, observed Mr. John Knightley coolly. But you need not imagine Mr. Weston to have felt what you would feel in giving up Henry or John. Mr. Weston is rather an easy, cheerful-tempered man than a man of strong feelings. He takes things as he finds them, and makes enjoyment of them somehow or other, depending, I suspect, much more upon what is called society for his comforts, that is, upon the power of eating and drinking, and playing whist with his neighbors 5 times a week, than upon family affection, or anything that home affords. Emma could not like what bordered on a reflection on Mr. Weston, and had half a mind to take it up, but she struggled and let it pass. She would keep the peace if possible, and there was something honorable and valuable in the strong domestic habits, the all-sufficiency of home to himself, whence resulted her brother's disposition to look down on the common rate of social intercourse and those to whom it was important. It had a high claim to forbearance. And now, chapter 12. Mr. Knightley was to dine with them, rather against the inclination of Mr. Woodhouse, who did not like that anyone should share with him in Isabella's first day. Emma's sense of right, however, had decided it, and besides the consideration of what was due to each brother, she had particular pleasure, from the circumstance of the late disagreement between Mr. Knightley and herself, in procuring him the proper invitation. She hoped they might now become friends again. She thought it was time to make up. Making up, indeed, would not do. She certainly had not been in the wrong, and he would never own that he had. Concession must be out of the question, but it was time to appear to forget that they had ever quarrelled, and she hoped it might rather assist the restoration of friendship that when he came into the room she had one of the children with her. The youngest, a nice little girl about 8 months old, who was now making her first visit to Hartfield, and very happy to be danced about in her aunt's arms. It did assist, for though he began with grave looks and short questions, he was soon led on to talk of them all in the usual way, and to take the child out of her arms with all the unceremoniousness of perfect amity. Emma felt that they were friends again, and the conviction giving her at first great satisfaction, and then a little sauciness, she could not help saying, as he was admiring the baby, "What a comfort it is that we think alike about our nephews and nieces. As to men and women, our opinions are sometimes very different, but with regard to these children, I observe we never disagree. If you were as much guided by nature in your estimate of men and women, and as little under the power of fancy and whim in your dealings with them, as you are where these children are concerned, we should always think alike. To be sure, our discordancies must always arise from my being in the wrong." "Yes," said he, smiling, "and reason good. I was 16 years old when you were born." "A material difference, then," she replied, "and no doubt you were much my superior in judgment at that period of our lives. But does not the lapse of 1 and 20 years bring our understandings a good deal nearer?" "Yes, a good deal nearer, but still not near enough to give me a chance of being right, if we think differently. I have still the advantage of you by 16 years' experience, and by not being a pretty young woman and a spoiled child. Come, my dear Emma, let us be friends, and say no more about it. Tell your aunt, little Emma, that she ought to set you a better example than to be renewing old grievances, and that if she were not wrong before, she is now." "That's true," she cried, "very true. Little Emma, grow up a better woman than your aunt. Be infinitely cleverer, and not half so conceited. Now, Mr. Knightley, a word or two more, and I have done. As far as good intentions went, we were both right, and I must say that no effects on my side of the argument have yet proved wrong. I only want to know that Mr. Martin is not very, very bitterly disappointed." "A man cannot be more so," was his short, full answer. "Ah, indeed, I am very sorry. Come, shake hands with me." This had just taken place, and with great cordiality, when John Knightley made his appearance, and "How do you do, George?" and "John, how are you?" succeeded in the true English style, burying under a calmness that seemed all but indifference the real attachment which would have led either of them, if requisite, to do everything for the good of the other. The evening was quiet and conversable, as Mr. Woodhouse declined cards entirely for the sake of comfortable talk with his dear Isabella, and the little party made two natural divisions: on one side he and his daughter, on the other the two Mr. Knightleys, their subjects totally distinct or very rarely mixing, and Emma only occasionally joining in one or the other. The brothers talked of their own concerns and pursuits, but principally of those of the elder, whose temper was by much the most communicative, and who was always the greater talker. As a magistrate, he had generally some point of law to consult John about, or at least some curious anecdote to give. And as a farmer, in keeping in hand the home farm at Donwell, he had to tell what every field was to bear next year, and to give all such local information as could not fail of being interesting to a brother whose home it had equally been the longest part of his life, and whose attachments were strong. The plan of a drain, the change of a fence, the felling of a tree, and the destination of every acre for wheat, turnips, or spring corn was entered into with as much equality of interest by John as his cooler manners rendered possible. And if his willing brother ever left him anything to inquire about, his inquiries even approached a tone of eagerness. While they were thus comfortably occupied, Mr. Woodhouse was enjoying a full flow of happy regrets and fearful affection with his daughter. "My poor dear Isabella," said he, fondly taking her hand and interrupting, for a few moments, her busy labors for some one of her 5 children. "How long it is, how terribly long since you were here! And how tired you must be after your journey! You must go to bed early, my dear. and I recommend a little gruel to you before you go. You and I will have a nice basin of gruel together. My dear Emma, suppose we all have a little gruel. Emma could not suppose any such thing, knowing, as she did, that both the Mr. Knightleys were as unpersuadable on that article as herself, and 2 basins only were ordered. After a little more discourse in praise of gruel, with some wondering at its not being taken every evening by everybody, he proceeded to say, with an air of grave reflection, "It was an awkward business, my dear, your spending the autumn at Southend instead of coming here. I never had much opinion of the sea air." "Mr. Wingfield most strenuously recommended it, sir, or we should not have gone. He recommended it for all the children, but particularly for the weakness in little Bella's throat, both sea air and bathing." "Ah, my dear, but Perry had many doubts about the sea doing her any good, and as to myself, I have been long perfectly convinced, though perhaps I never told you so before, that the sea is very rarely of use to anybody. I am sure it almost killed me once." "Come, come," cried Emma, feeling this to be an unsafe subject, "I must beg you not to talk of the sea. It makes me envious and miserable, I who have never seen it. Southend is prohibited, if you please. My dear Isabella, I have not heard you make one inquiry after Mr. Perry yet, and he never forgets you." "Oh, good Mr. Perry! How is he, sir?" "Why, pretty well, but not quite well. Poor Perry is bilious, and he has not time to take care of himself. He tells me he has not time to take care of himself, which is very sad. But he is always wanted all round the country. I suppose there is not a man in such practice anywhere, but then there is not so clever a man anywhere." "And Mrs. Perry and the children, how are they? Do the children grow? I have a great regard for Mr. Perry. I hope he will be calling soon. He will be so pleased to see my little ones." "I hope he will be here tomorrow, for I have a question or two to ask him about myself of some consequence. And, my dear, whenever he comes, you had better let him look at little Bella's throat." "Oh, my dear sir, her throat is so much better that I have hardly any uneasiness about it. Either bathing has been of the greatest service to her, or else it is to be attributed to an excellent embrocation of Mr. Wingfield's, which we have been applying at times ever since August." "It is not very likely, my dear, that bathing should have been of use to her, and if I had known you were wanting an embrocation, I would have spoken to—" "You seem to have forgotten Mrs. and Miss Bates," said Emma. "I have not heard one inquiry about them." "Oh, the good Bateses! I am quite ashamed of myself. But you mention them in most of your letters. I hope they are quite well. Good old Mrs. Bates! I will call upon her tomorrow and take my children. They are always so pleased to see my children. And that excellent Miss Bates, such thorough, worthy people. How are they, sir?" "Why, pretty well, my dear, upon the whole. But poor Mrs. Bates had a bad cold about a month ago." "How sorry I am! But colds are never so prevalent as they have been this autumn. Mr. Wingfield told me that he had never known them more general or heavy, except when it has been quite an influenza." "That has been a great deal the case, my dear, but not to the degree you mention. Perry says that colds have been very general, but not so heavy as he has very often known them in November. Perry does not call it altogether a sickly season." "No, I do not know that Mr. Wingfield considers it very sickly, except—" "Ah, my poor dear child, the truth is that in London it is always a sickly season. Nobody is healthy in London. Nobody can be. It is a dreadful thing to have you forced to live there, so far off, and the air so bad." No, indeed. We are not at all in a bad air. Our part of London is so very superior to most others. You must not confound us with London in general, my dear sir. The neighborhood of Brunswick Square is very different from almost all the rest. We are so very airy. I should be unwilling, I own, to live in any other part of the town. There is hardly any other that I could be satisfied to have my children in. But we are so remarkably airy. Mr. Wingfield thinks the vicinity of Brunswick Square decidedly the most favorable as to air. Ah, my dear, it is not like Hartfield. You make the best of it. But after you have been a week at Hartfield, you are all of you different creatures. You do not look like the same. Now, I cannot say that I think you are any of you looking well at present. I am sorry to hear you say so, sir, but I assure you, excepting those little nervous headaches and palpitations which I am never entirely free from anywhere, I am quite well myself, and if the children were rather pale before they went to bed, it was only because they were a little more tired than usual from their journey and the happiness of coming. I think you will think better of their looks tomorrow, for I assure you Mr. Wingfield told me that he did not believe he had ever sent us off altogether in such good case. I trust, at least, that you do not think Mr. Knightley looking ill, turning her eyes with affectionate anxiety toward her husband. Middling, my dear. I cannot compliment you. I think Mr. John Knightley very far from looking well. "Oh, what is the matter, sir? Did you speak to me?" cried Mr. John Knightley, hearing his own name. "I am sorry to find, my love, that my father does not think you looking well, but I hope it is only from being a little fatigued. I could have wished, however, as you know, that you had seen Mr. Wingfield before you left home." "My dear Isabella," exclaimed he hastily, "pray do not concern yourself about my looks. Be satisfied with doctoring and coddling yourself and the children, and let me look as I choose." "I did not thoroughly understand what you were telling your brother," cried Emma, "about your friend Mr. Graham's intending to have a bailiff from Scotland to look after his new estate. But will it answer? Will not the old prejudice be too strong?" And she talked in this way so long and successfully that, when forced to give her attention again to her father and sister, she had nothing worse to hear than Isabella's kind inquiry after Jane Fairfax. And Jane Fairfax, though no great favourite with her in general, she was at that moment very happy to assist in praising. "That sweet, amiable Jane Fairfax," said Mrs. John Knightley. "It is so long since I have seen her, except now and then for a moment accidentally in town. What happiness it must be to her good old grandmother and excellent aunt when she comes to visit them! I always regret excessively on dear Emma's account that she cannot be more at Highbury, but now their daughter is married, I suppose Colonel and Mrs. Campbell will not be able to part with her at all. She would be such a delightful companion for Emma." Mr. Woodhouse agreed to it all, but added, "Our little friend Harriet Smith, however, is just such another pretty kind of young person. You will like Harriet. Emma could not have a better companion than Harriet." "I am most happy to hear it. But only Jane Fairfax one knows to be so very accomplished and superior, and exactly Emma's age." This topic was discussed very happily, and others succeeded of similar moment, and passed away with similar harmony. But the evening did not close without a little return of agitation. The gruel came and supplied a great deal to be said, much praise and many comments, undoubting decision of its wholesomeness for every constitution, and pretty severe philippics upon the many houses where it was never met with tolerable, but unfortunately among the failures which the daughters had to instance, the most recent and therefore most prominent was in her own cook at Southend, a young woman hired for the time, who never had been able to understand what she meant by a basin of nice, smooth gruel, thin, but not too thin. Often as she had wished for and ordered it, she had never been able to get anything tolerable. Here was a dangerous opening. "Ah!" said Mr. Woodhouse, shaking his head and fixing his eyes on her with tender concern. The ejaculation in Emma's ear expressed, "Ah, there is no end of the sad consequences of your going to Southend. It does not bear talking of." And for a little while she hoped he would not talk of it, and that a silent rumination might suffice to restore him to the relish of his own smooth gruel. After an interval of some minutes, however, he began with, "I shall always be very sorry that you went to the sea this autumn, instead of coming here." "But why should you be sorry, sir? I assure you it did the children a great deal of good." "And moreover, if you must go to the sea, it had better not have been to Southend. Southend is an unhealthy place. Perry was surprised to hear you had fixed upon Southend." "I know there is such an idea with many people, but indeed it is quite a mistake, sir. We all had our health perfectly well there, never found the least inconvenience from the mud, and Mr. Wingfield says it is entirely a mistake to suppose the place unhealthy, and I am sure he may be depended on, for he thoroughly understands the nature of the air, and his own brother and family have been there repeatedly." "You should have gone to Cromer, my dear, if you went anywhere. Perry was a week at Cromer once, and he holds it to be the best of all the sea-bathing places. A fine open sea, he says, and very pure air. And by what I understand, you might have had lodgings there quite away from the sea, a quarter of a mile off, very comfortable. You should have consulted Perry." "But, my dear sir, the difference of the journey. Only consider how great it would have been, 100 miles perhaps, instead of 40." "Ah, my dear, as Perry says, where health is at stake, nothing else should be considered. And if one is to travel, there is not much to choose between 40 miles and 100. Better not move at all. Better stay in London altogether than travel 40 miles to get into a worse air." This is just what Perry said. It seemed to him a very ill-judged measure. Emma's attempts to stop her father had been vain, and when he had reached such a point as this, she could not wonder at her brother-in-law's breaking out. "Mr. Perry," said he, in a voice of very strong displeasure, "would do as well to keep his opinion till it is asked for. Why does he make it any business of his to wonder at what I do, at my taking my family to one part of the coast or another? I may be allowed, I hope, the use of my own judgment as well as Mr. Perry. I want his directions no more than his drugs." He paused, and growing cooler in a moment, added, with only sarcastic dryness, "If Mr. Perry can tell me how to convey a wife and 5 children a distance of 130 miles with no greater expense or inconvenience than a distance of 40, I should be as willing to prefer Cromer to Southend as he could himself." "True, true," cried Mr. Knightley, with most ready interposition. "Very true. That's a consideration indeed. But, John, as to what I was telling you of my idea of moving the path to Langham, of turning it more to the right, that it may not cut through the home meadows, I cannot conceive any difficulty. I should not attempt it if it were to be the means of inconvenience to the Highbury people, but if you call to mind exactly the present line of the path. The only way of proving it, however, will be to turn to our maps. I shall see you at the Abbey tomorrow morning, I hope, and then we will look them over, and you shall give me your opinion." Mr. Woodhouse was rather agitated by such harsh reflections on his friend Perry, to whom he had, in fact, though unconsciously, been attributing many of his own feelings and expressions. But the soothing attentions of his daughters gradually removed the present evil, and the immediate alertness of one brother, and better recollections of the other, prevented any renewal of it. And now chapter 13 of Emma by Jane Austen. Chapter 13. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley in this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children, and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. She had nothing to wish otherwise, but that the days did not pass so swiftly. It was a delightful visit, perfect in being much too short. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings. But one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial. They must all dine at Randall's one day. Even Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to think it a possible thing in preference to a division of the party. How they were all to be conveyed, he would have made a difficulty if he could. But as his son and daughter's carriage and horses were actually at Hartfield, he was not able to make more than a simple question on that head. It hardly amounted to a doubt, nor did it occupy Emma long to convince him that they might be in one of the carriages, nor did it take Emma long to convince him that they might in one of the carriages find room for Harriet also. Harriet, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley, their own especial set, were the only persons invited to meet them. The hours were to be early as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclination being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event, for it was a very great event that Mr. Woodhouse should dine out on the 24th of December, had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home so much indisposed with a cold that, but for her own earnest wish of being nursed by Mrs. Goddard, Emma could not have allowed her to leave the house. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randalls. She was very feverish, and had a bad sore throat. Mrs. Goddard was full of care and affection. Mr. Perry was talked of, and Harriet herself was too ill and low to resist the authority which excluded her from this delightful engagement, though she could not speak of her loss without many tears. Emma sat with her as long as she could, to attend her in Mrs. Goddard's unavoidable absences, and raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of his having a most comfortless visit, and of their all missing her very much. She had not advanced many yards from Mrs. Goddard's door when she was met by Mr. Elton himself, evidently coming towards it, and as they walked on slowly together in conversation about the invalid, of whom he, on the rumor of considerable illness, had been going to inquire, that he might carry some report of her to Hartfield, they were overtaken by Mr. John Knightley returning from the daily visit to Donwell, with his two eldest boys, whose healthy glowing faces showed all the benefit of a country run, and seemed to ensure a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for. They joined company and proceeded together. Emma was just describing the nature of her friend's complaint. A throat very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her, a quick low pulse, etc., and she was sorry to find from Mrs. Goddard that Harriet was liable to very bad sore throats, and had often alarmed her with them. Mr. Elton looked all alarm on the occasion, as he exclaimed, "A sore throat! I hope not infectious. I hope not of a putrid infectious sort. Has Perry seen her? Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as your friend. Let me entreat you to run no risks. Why does not Perry see her?" Emma, who was not really at all frightened herself, tranquilized this excess of apprehension by assurances of Mrs. Goddard's experience and care. But as there must still remain a degree of uneasiness which she could not wish to reason away, which she would rather feed and assist than not, she added soon afterwards, as if quite another subject, "It is so cold, so very cold, and looks and feels so very much like snow, that if it were to any other place, or with any other party, I should really try not to go out to-day, and dissuade my father from venturing. But as he has made up his mind, and does not seem to feel the cold himself, I do not like to interfere, as I know it would be so great a disappointment to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But upon my word, Mr. Elton, in your case, I should certainly excuse myself. You appear to me a little hoarse already, and when you consider what demand of voice and what fatigues tomorrow will bring, I think it would be no more than common prudence to stay at home and take care of yourself tonight." Mr. Elton looked as if he did not very well know what answer to make, which was exactly the case, for though very much gratified by the kind care of such a fair lady, and not liking to resist any advice of hers, he had not really the least inclination to give up the visit. But Emma, too eager and busy in her own previous conceptions and views to hear him impartially, or see him with clear vision, was very well satisfied with his muttering acknowledgment of its being very cold, certainly very cold, and walked on, rejoicing in having extricated him from Randalls, and secured him the power of sending to inquire after Harriet every hour of the evening. "You do quite right," said she. "We will make your apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Weston." But hardly had she so spoken when she found her brother was civilly offering a seat in his carriage, if the weather were Mr. Elton's only objection, and Mr. Elton actually accepting the offer with much prompt satisfaction. It was a done thing. Mr. Elton was to go, and never had his broad, handsome face expressed more pleasure than at this moment. Never had his smile been stronger, nor his eyes more exulting than when he next looked at her. Well, said she to herself, this is most strange. After I had got him off so well, to choose to go into company and leave Harriet ill behind? Most strange indeed. But there is, I believe, in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their employments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives way to it. And this must be the case with Mr. Elton, a most valuable, amiable, pleasing young man undoubtedly, and very much in love with Harriet. But still he cannot refuse an invitation. He must dine out wherever he is asked. What a strange thing love is! He can see ready wit in Harriet, but will not dine alone for her. Soon afterwards Mr. Elton quitted them, and she could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice while assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report, and he sighed and smiled himself off in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favour. After a few minutes of entire silence between them, John Knightley began with, I never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It is downright labour to him where ladies are concerned. With men he can be rational and unaffected, but when he has ladies to please, every feature works. Mr. Elton's manners are not perfect, replied Emma, but where there is a wish to please, one ought to overlook, and one does overlook a great deal. Where a man does his best with only moderate powers, he will have the advantage over negligent superiority. There is such perfect good temper and good will in Mr. Elton as one cannot but value. Yes, said Mr. John Knightley presently, with some slyness. He seems to have a great deal of goodwill towards you. Me? She replied with a smile of astonishment. Are you imagining me to be Mr. Elton's object? Such an imagination has crossed me, I own, Emma, and if it never occurred to you before, you may as well take it into consideration now. Mr. Elton in love with me! What an idea! I do not say it is so, but you will do well to consider whether it is so or not, and to regulate your behavior accordingly. I think your manners to him encouraging. I speak as a friend, Emma. You had better look about you and ascertain what you do and what you mean to do. I thank you, but I assure you you are quite mistaken. Mr. Elton and I are very good friends, and nothing more. And she walked on, amusing herself in the consideration of the blunders which often arise from a partial knowledge of circumstances, of the mistakes which people of high pretensions to judgment are for ever falling into, and not very well pleased with her brother for imagining her blind and ignorant and in want of counsel. He said no more. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit that in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others, too full of the wonder of his own going, and the pleasure it was to afford at Randalls to see that it was cold, and too well wrapped up to feel it. The cold, however, was severe, and by the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humour. The preparing and the going abroad in such weather, with the sacrifice of his children after dinner, were evils, were disagreeables at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. A man, said he, must have a very good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside and encounter such a day as this for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It is the greatest absurdity, actually snowing at this moment. The folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, and defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man, in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself, and keep all under shelter that he can. Here are we setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said and heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again tomorrow. Going in dismal weather, to return probably in worse. 4 horses and 4 servants taking out for nothing but to convey 5 idle, shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home. Emma did not find herself equal to give the pleased assent, which no doubt he was in the habit of receiving, to emulate the "very true, my love," which must have been usually administered by his travelling companion. But she had resolution enough to refrain from making any answer at all. She could not be complying. She dreaded being quarrelsome. Her heroism reached only to silence. She allowed him to talk, and arranged the glasses, and wrapped herself up without opening her lips. They arrived, the carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black, and smiling, was with them instantly. Emma thought with pleasure of some change of subject. Mr. Elton was all obligation and cheerfulness. He was so very cheerful in his civilities indeed, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet from what had reached her. She had sent while dressing, and the answer had been much the same, not better. "My report from Mrs. Goddard's," said she presently, "was not so pleasant as I had hoped." "Not better was my answer." His face lengthened immediately, and his voice was the voice of sentiment as he answered, "Oh, no, I am grieved to find. I was on the point of telling you that when I called at Mrs. Goddard's door, which I did the very last thing before I returned to dress, I was told that Miss Smith was not better, by no means better, rather worse. Very much grieved and concerned. I had flattered myself that she must be better after such a cordial as I knew had been given in the morning." Emma smiled and answered, "My visit was of use to the nervous part of her complaint, I hope, but not even I can charm away a sore throat. It is a most severe cold indeed. Mr. Perry has been with her, as you probably heard." "Yes, I imagined. That is, I did not." "He has been used to her in these complaints, and I hope tomorrow morning will bring us both a more comfortable report. But it is impossible not to find uneasiness. Such a sad loss to our party today." "Dreadful. Exactly so indeed. She will be missed every moment." This was very proper. The sigh which accompanied it was really estimable, but it should have lasted longer. Emma was rather in dismay when only half a minute afterwards he began to speak of other things, and in a voice of the greatest alacrity and enjoyment. "What an excellent device," said he, "the use of a sheepskin for carriages! How very comfortable they make it! Impossible to feel cold with such precautions. The contrivances of modern days, indeed, have rendered a gentleman's carriage perfectly complete. One is so fenced and guarded from the weather that not a breath of air can find its way unpermitted. Weather becomes absolutely of no consequence. It is a very cold afternoon, but in this carriage we know nothing of the matter. Ha! Snows a little, I see." "Yes," said Mr. John Knightley, "and I think we shall have a good deal of it." "Christmas weather," observed Mr. Elton, "quite seasonable, and extremely fortunate we may think ourselves that it did not begin yesterday and prevent this day's party, which it might very possibly have done, for Mr. Woodhouse would hardly have ventured had there been much snow on the ground. But now it is of no consequence. This is quite the season indeed for friendly meetings. At Christmas, everybody invites their friends about them, and people think little of even the worst weather. I was snowed up at a friend's house once for a week. Nothing could be pleasanter. I went for only one night and could not get away till the very next send night. Mr. John Knightley looked as if he did not comprehend the pleasure, but said only coolly, I cannot wish to be snowed up a week at Randall's. At another time, Emma might have been amused, but she was too much astonished now at Mr. Elton's spirits for other feelings. Harriet seemed quite forgotten in the expectation of a pleasant party. We are sure of excellent fires, continued he, and everything in the greatest comfort. Charming people, Mr. and Mrs. Weston. Mrs. Weston indeed is much beyond praise, and he is exactly what one values, so hospitable and so fond of society. It will be a small party, but where small parties are select, they are perhaps the most agreeable of any. Mr. Weston's dining room does not accommodate more than 10 comfortably, and for my part I would rather, under such circumstances, fall short by 2 than exceed by 2. I think you will agree with me, turning with a soft air to Emma. I think I shall certainly have your approbation, though Mr. Knightley, perhaps, from being used to the large parties of London, may not quite enter into our feelings. I know nothing of the large parties of London, sir. I never dine with anybody. Indeed, in a tone of wonder and pity. I had no idea that the law had been so great a slavery. Well, sir, the time must come when you will be paid for all this, when you will have little labor and great enjoyment. My first enjoyment, replied Mr. John Knightley, as they passed through the sweep gate, will be to find myself safe at Hartfield again. And on that ominous note, let's see if they make it safely to Randall's and if they make it safely back to Hartfield within that same evening or if they get snowed in. We'll find out more tomorrow in our read along of Emma by Jane Austen. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you tomorrow for more Valentine ET. Bye.